Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us online. I have the real pleasure of welcoming Ed Luce to discuss his new biography. This is Zbig, The Life of Zbigniew Brzezinski, America's Great Power Prophet. It is a absolutely superb book in so many ways. It's a great biography and incredibly well written, but it's also the story of Cold War politics, the story of Washington across a critical era of U.S. foreign policy making, and much more. Ed is currently the U.S. national editor and columnist at the Financial Times. He's covered American politics and foreign policy for more than 2 decades. And with this biography of Zbigniew Brzezinski, who of course was President Jimmy Carter's national security advisor and a lifelong Sovietologist, he's produced really a wonderful, comprehensive picture of Brzezinski's life and so much of the context around his life that is interesting and instructive, including for the way we think about some of the critical issues today. I'm looking forward to our conversation and to discussing the book and Brzezinski's origins, what he got right about the trajectory of American power, maybe some places where things fell short, and also what kind of lessons his life and career portend for today's geopolitical environment. Before we get started, just a couple of logistical details. If you're watching online, you can participate in the discussion by entering questions in the chat box. That's at cnas.org/live. And we'll try to get to some of those in the Q&A portion. And let me bring in Ed to kick off the conversation. Ed, thanks for joining us. Congratulations again on this superb book. And maybe we can start by you telling us why, of all the topics that you could write on, and you've written on India, and you've written on the American middle class, and you've written on many things, you decided to write a biography of Zbigniew Brzezinski.
Well, first of all, Richard, thanks so much for having me on. It's a real delight to be with you personally and CNAS generally and your audience. And also, just on a personal note, your special assistant, I forget her job title, but Gibbs McKinley, was my research assistant on this book, and she was indispensable. And I hope and imagine she is as valuable to your work as she was in helping me with this book. So why did I do it? Well, I mean, very bluntly, his family came to me with these diaries that he kept when he was national security advisor, which the way those who knew Brzezinski, the way he talked in fully formed paragraphs into his dictaphone in the White House car on the way back to McLean, Virginia every night, sort of half an hour journey. And that's a lot of words. I mean, it's a Tolstoyan length diary. And once I'd got into this sort of gripping first draft of history, because remember that period, the 70s was a very geopolitical decade. Once I got into it, and once I'd ascertained that this would be without strings attached, that the family would read the book at the same time as everyone else, that I, in other words, would not be the authorized biographer, then that and the fact that Brzezinski hasn't had a full English language biography, although there was a very good one translated by a French diplomat called Justin Vase, but that was more of an intellectual biography. The fact that there was this huge gap, he was a major grand strategist of American foreign policy, and there hadn't been a full biography, I thought, well, I would be delighted to fill that gap.
Great. I just want to second for 1 second what you said about our great colleague, Gibbs McKinley, who has been such a great researcher on the book that I wrote and so much else, and has been writing. So she's absolutely fantastic. So Gibbs, if you're listening, thank you from both of us. Let's talk about the subtitle here, America's Great Power Prophet. It's pretty amazing, actually, in the story that you tell, to look at the thesis, the undergraduate thesis that Brzezinski wrote. I think it was in 1950, 22 years old. and he identifies the nationalities problem as the Achilles heel of not just the Eastern Bloc, so not just Polish nationality, national feeling, and Czech national feeling, but within the Soviet Union itself, the Uzbeks, the Kazakhs, the Ukrainians. And so my question is, one, how did he know this? I mean, 22 years old, nobody else seemed to be writing this, including people who are spending their whole careers at the time trying to analyze this problem. Two, it sounds like this, in a way, became kind of his animating life's work in so many ways. So is that accurate? And then three, was he truly right? Did that become the Achilles heel that led to the unraveling of the Soviet Union?
Yeah, it's a brilliant question, because to get, as a biographer, a paper like that written when the subject of a biography is only 22 in 1950, that is still relevant 50 years later when the Cold War ends, and indeed has animated that figure's public and intellectual career in those 4 subsequent decades, is an extraordinary through line for any biography. And what he sets out there is that, as you rightly described, the Soviet Union's Achilles heel is its nationalism. Now, remember, this is very early in the Cold War. He's a student at McGill in Montreal, where his father had been posted as Polish consul general just before the Second World War, getting his family, including a 10-year-old Zbig, out of the way pretty knowingly. A few days after Munich, they crossed the Atlantic. And so the context of this is that George Kennan had created this doctrine of containment. Is an anonymous article by X in Foreign Affairs, The Sources of Soviet Conduct, 3 years earlier in 1947. And containment was the Cold War strategy. But it had nothing, it was about stopping Soviet advancement further into Western Europe and other parts of the world, containing it. Had very little to say about what happened behind the Iron Curtain. And so, first of all, you know, the remarkable thing about this thesis, it's called Russo-Soviet nationalism. First of all, is just the age of Brzezinski. He's 22 and he's breaking new ground in the field of Sovietology, you know, at that age, in this very brash, declarative way. But second, it was a pretty unique argument. I mean, most Sovietologists saw the Eastern Bloc as a monolith, and that basically what they had to pay attention to was Moscow. And I think Brzezinski's Polishness, what had happened to Poland, why his family were essentially exiled, and again at the hands of the Russians, this time Bolshevik Russians, but, you know, throughout history, the Tsars had been the sort of ogres in Polish nationalist sort of imagination and reality. That gave him an insight into, you know, what the Ukrainians felt, what the Georgians felt, what the Kazakhs felt, etc. That they didn't feel like they were Soviet citizens. They didn't speak a language called Soviet. They saw themselves as being part of a Russian empire, dressed up in Marxian clothing. So I think this was an extraordinary, original and bold insight that gradually sort of becomes a pretty mainstream view. And as I say, animates what he does when he finally gets into public life in the 60s and 70s. A gift to a biography. It's a fascinating document.
And you talk about Brzezinski and his Polish background and how that animated his thinking about Russia, the Soviet Union, even America's place in the world. It's a little curious in some ways. I think he only lived in Poland like 3 years total in his life, but he lived in Canada, what, 12 or 13 or something like that. Did that shape his worldview at all? Being educated in Canada, being north of the border, all this other stuff, or
in a way, as a sort of journey down the East Coast. So he goes from Montreal after that thesis to Harvard, gets a scholarship to do his PhD at Harvard. So he goes Montreal to Cambridge. Then, having been denied tenureship at Harvard, you know, goes to Columbia at the end of that decade, and then of course ends up in Washington and never leaves. So it's a sort of steady journey towards Washington. And I think, you know, there are some Canadians who think he spurned Canada or saw it as too provincial. I think he was very fond of Canada. I mean, it provided a remarkable refuge for him and his family, to escape the sort of inferno that was visited on Poland, that began the Second World War. And he excelled there. I mean, a year after turning up, without speaking a word of English, he was coming first, getting the first an English prize, an English poetry prize. So, I mean, he was a very, very gifted student. But Canada just wasn't a big enough stage for him. His goal was to liberate Eastern Europe from Soviet rule. And that was his goal from his teen years onwards. I mean, I have the diaries that he kept as all through his life, but including as a teenager. And there's a bit about which girls he fancies and which ones he's stolen kisses from, etc. All kind of a bit cringeworthy how he describes it all, but quite funny. But mostly these diaries from age 11 onwards are about the detail of the Second World War and then the detail of the early onset of the Cold War. I mean, this guy was obsessional about reversing Soviet occupation of the captive nations, as they were then called.
You have a good and a pretty lengthy treatment of the very complicated relationship between Henry Kissinger and Zbigniew Brzezinski, both Harvard rivals. They each had a Rockefeller patron. They, one trilateral commission, one CFR, and they had all this kind of stuff. But one of the things that maybe you can talk about is it seemed Kissinger's ascendance in the Nixon administration seemed to open Zbig's mind as to what would be possible for him personally, just in terms of how far one could go up the ladder in a place like American foreign policy making. So can you talk a little bit about the nature of their relationship and why it went on as it did for so long? And then also, this sort of realization that he appears to have had about what might be possible for him.
Yeah, I mean, I think of it as kind of a cinematic relationship, and forgive me, there are police cars whizzing past if you hear that in the background. They arrived on North America's shores within weeks of each other. Brzezinski, as I say, was 10. Family arrived in New York, took a train to Montreal, October 1938, and 15-year-old Heinz Kissinger, whose family were fleeing what they knew was coming, arrived a few weeks before. So I think it was August 1938. They didn't meet them, but just biographically, that's a fascinating sort of coincidence. They met first in 1950, and Brzezinski didn't particularly like Kissinger's approach. He found it very heavy and Germanic and Spenglerian. So he didn't, Kissinger was 5 years older than him. He didn't study with them. And they weren't really rivals. They were both sort of fellow luminaries during the 1950s, particularly Kissinger, whose thesis on Metternich, became a very unlikely bestseller nationally and on the 1815 Congress of Vienna. They didn't really start to clash until the late 60s, when Kissinger was playing all sides in the 1968 election. He was allegedly working for Nelson Rockefeller, but he was trying to join Hubert Humphreys, the vice president and the Democratic nominee, for whom Brzezinski was the lead foreign policy person. And so he was talking with Brzezinski, but all the while, unbeknown to everybody, he was actually having real back channel talks with Nixon. But he was sort of touting around all the Oppo research that he had. And when Nixon makes Kissinger his national security advisor in late November 1968, that day Brzezinski realizes, okay, so somebody with a foreign accent, who's foreign born, an immigrant with a funny name, can make it to the highest level in American foreign policy. That's when he scaled up his ambitions. But that's also where the rivalry between Kissinger and Brzezinski really starts to become quite sharp. They never fell out. They were too fascinated by each other's company. I mean, every few weeks, even at the sort of most tense moments when Brzezinski was quite a lacerating critic of the Nixon administration and then that Ford. Even at the most tense moments, they would meet at this restaurant, usually Sans Souci, a French restaurant near the White House that's since closed. But it was a very public restaurant. Kissinger liked to be seen. And they would meet and chat and send letters. And so their correspondence is quite interesting. And Brzezinski's last really big public event was in December 2016 in Oslo, where he's given a sort of Lifetime Achievement Award. It's not a Nobel Peace Prize, but it is from the Nobel Peace Prize Committee. And on stage with him, this is a few weeks before Brzezinski died, on stage with him is Henry Kissinger. So if you start the clock in 1938 and you ended in 2017 when Brzezinski died, that is a pretty cinematic arc. And it's an extraordinary relationship between these two rivals, frenemies, these grand strategists of the Cold War.
And so the Carter campaign kicks off, and then, of course, Carter's elected, and Brzezinski becomes National Security Advisor. There was a Secretary of State, Cyrus Vance, and the two nearly cinematic, maybe, relationships seem to be Carter-Brzezinski, just because if you could have picked two more different people, I don't know who they would be, but it seemed to go together in a very untraditional way. I mean, this wasn't, it wasn't even Nixon Kissinger in terms of the president started trying to lay out a vision on China or something, for example. So maybe you can talk about that. And then also, did the Carter administration begin with the president or anyone else having the notion that the center of foreign policy making would be at the National Security Council rather than the State Department or the Pentagon or something like that? And what was that Brzezinski-Vance relationship like during the Carter administration?
So the Carter-Brzezinski relationship is just so improbable and unusual. When Brzezinski set up the Trilateral Commission in the early 70s, as you mentioned earlier, he had a Rockefeller. His Rockefeller was David Rockefeller. Kissinger's was Nelson. It's a bit like being a sort of great artist in medieval Florence. You needed a Medici, And so Rockefeller financed the sort of launch of the Trilateral Commission. And what was it? It was a rival to Bilderberg, which Kissinger was the sort of luminary of. And so, that is also part of this rivalry. And Carter is this unknown, little known, one-term Georgia New South governor, so pro-civil rights, but also somebody who was trilateral, which he sort of fit the criteria, meaning Georgia had trade offices in Tokyo as well as in Brussels, and Japan was the tri-bit or the trilateral. And he knew nothing about foreign policy, and he used the Trilateral Commission to basically do crash course in how the world works and the big foreign policy issues. And Brzezinski sort of became his tutor. So you have this really unlikely relationship between this Baptist Sunday school nuclear engineer, not quite, but a nuclear submariner that Carter had been, this peanut farmer, and this Machiavellian Polish American, which became an incredibly close relationship. I mean, the sort of notes that they would exchange and the sort of tone of their relationship was very different to Kissinger-Nixon, which I think was sort of riddled with mistrust, but fascination. But it was a very psychologically complex relationship. And it wasn't quite one of equals, because Nixon had been vice president for 8 years. He knew a lot about foreign policy. And in fact, some of the big ideas like the opening to China came from Nixon, not Kissinger. With Brzezinski and Carter, the big ideas came from Brzezinski. And Carter, I think, started out thinking, well, we've got to restore US administrations to how they should be done. We don't want a Kissinger. We don't want this impresario, acrobatic foreign policy. With me, we're getting transparent and rigorous and professional administration. And Cy Vance, therefore, should lead foreign policy, and Brzezinski will be my chief advisor. But in practice, Carter got very bored with the State Department sort of foot dragging on everything, and its tendency to argue the sort of Soviet world view in his eyes and in Brzezinski's eyes, because Vance's overwhelming priority was to get another nuclear arms agreement signed, and therefore wanted to turn a blind eye to all the adventurism that Brezhnev, the Soviet leader, was conducting around the world in the Horn of Africa, Central America, Afghanistan later on. And so just over time, Carter stopped listening to State. And State, Brzezinski and Vance themselves personally got along reasonably well, but people around Vance leaked quite heavily against Brzezinski, and Brzezinski leaked back. I mean, the ones who were probably the most persistent leakers were Richard Holbrooke, working for Vance. I mean, I think Hodding Carter, no relation of Jimmy, but the State Department spokesman. I mean, there were several there who were very anti-Zbig. The media was anti-Zbig. The media was really with Vance. But ultimately, the big battles, almost every big foreign policy battle, for good or for ill, was won by Brzezinski, and Carter came to sort of trust him implicitly. It's a fascinating relationship, and he could be rude to Carter, and very blunt with him. There was sort of no holds barred. It was a very frank, and it started every morning. Carter's first meeting was with Brzezinski between half an hour and an hour every single morning.
Well, another thing that is so unusual about that relationship that you talk about, I don't know whether you describe it as Carter's humility or willingness to sort of share the stage almost, but I mean, until I guess Big stopped him, describing him as Zbig's student. I mean, this is the guy who wants to be president and then is president. And then something that I just find absolutely mind-boggling in the context of recent presidents is the Deng Xiaoping dinner, especially including the caviar incident, which maybe you can tell, but also what that says about Carter and Brzezinski, that Deng Xiaoping was at his house rather than the White House.
It is bizarre, and as you said, it's very telling, because this is the first ever visit of a Chinese leader to America ever, and Deng Xiaoping's first night on American soil was spent not at the White House at a state dinner or Blair House at a pre-state dinner, but Brzezinski's home in McLean, Virginia. And Carter had no problem with that. Can you imagine any other president having no problem with that? Yes, and it wasn't catered. It was Muska, Brzezinski's very patient and productive in terms of cooking, the amount she cooked. She cooked dinner for the Chinese entourage, and it was served by Ian, Mark, and Mika Brzezinski, the three Brzezinski children, who were 11, 13, and 15. And Mika, the 11-year-old, dropped a bunch of caviar, Russian caviar, by the way. They were served Russian vodka and Russian caviar, gifts to Brzezinski from the Soviet ambassador, Dobrynin, which Deng Xiaoping found hysterically funny. They toasted death to the Soviets with Soviet vodka. She spills this caviar in Deng Xiaoping's lap, gets in a fluster, grabs a napkin, and starts furiously trying to clean up the caviar, which of course involved rubbing his groin. And so I think she had to be disengaged. But it has become, it's entered family law. There is one other Mika thing. During the famous Camp David negotiations that Carter held between Israel and Egypt for those 13 days. She was there. She was friends with Amy Carter. So they sort of hung out together and shared a cabin. And they ran over Menachem Begin in their golf buggy. So, world leaders had to steer clear of Mika Brzezinski.
I want to encourage folks, if they have questions, put them in the chat box, and I'll try to get to some. In the meantime, I'm going to keep going with mine as we sort of walk through some of this history. Maybe the last relationship that I'll ask you about is another very remarkable one. After 400 years, you have a non-Italian pope, which happens to be Polish. and you have the first Polish-American national security advisor at the same time. I think it's fair to say they had at least similar worldviews about the nature of Russia and the captive nations and Poland itself. How did Brzezinski get to know Cardinal Wojtyła in the first place? And then what was that interaction like once, one was in the West Wing and the other in the Vatican?
Yeah, it was extraordinary serendipity, as you say, to have the first non-Italian Pope in almost half a millennium. By the way, there hasn't been an Italian Pope since then either. But the first non-Italian Pope, being Polish and having already met Brzezinski, and then the first and to date last Polish-speaking national security advisor, to have them at the same time at that juncture in history of the Cold War, remarkable serendipity. They had met at Wojtyła's request a couple of years before he was elected Pope. He was elected Pope in 1978. So they'd met at his request when the Cardinal was at Harvard giving some theological lectures, and he'd asked Brzezinski to come down from his holiday vacation home in Maine, Northeast Harbor, to meet him. And they had a long and sort of, I guess, quite intellectual conversation about the situation in Poland. And both the Pope matched Brzezinski's keenness and knowledge about how far you could push the Soviets, what role the church could play, where dissent could be safely advanced, etc. They had very tactical conversations about what to do behind the Iron Curtain, and they, started this long correspondence. And Brzezinski would always joke that the Pope was like a world leader and Carter was like a religious leader, and the Pope loved this joke and repeated it back to him a few times. And the Pope also joked that you elected me Pope to Brzezinski, because the KGB, Yuri Andropov, who later became leader of the Soviet Union, was convinced that this was a Brzezinski plot to get a Pole elected Pope. It wasn't, but there was a KGB report detailing how that happened. What happened in practice was there was a division. The Italian and Spanish cardinals were deadlocked. And so the joke was in the White House that there was a deadlock, so they took a poll. But then
early dad jokes.
bad dad jokes, exactly. But so just to sort of complete that point, because it's really significant, when the Soviets were on the verge of invading Poland in 1980, after Carter had lost to Reagan, but was still president, the transition period, it looked like 1968 Czechoslovakia, 1956 Hungary, all over again. But I think substantially, but because of the Pope's relationship with Brzezinski, the way they coordinated, and in turn their relationship with Lech Walesa, this young firebrand trade union leader, the head of Solidarity, they were able to persuade the Soviets that Poland would be indigestible. And so it's an immensely significant relationship. Now, there are other sort of people involved. This guy, Kuklinski, probably the CIA's, one of its most valuable assets ever, was the chief of the Polish general staff's liaison with the Soviet general staff. And he just passed on all the invasion plans. So Brzezinski was getting this raw intelligence in Polish. He did not want the CIA to translate it or interpret it. He wanted it raw so that he could see it for himself. Kuklinski was the other sort of really key piece there. But the Pope and Brzezinski, that's also kind of cinematic.
And I think it's probably fair to say that the high point of the Carter foreign policy record was Camp David, and the low point Iran with Desert One and the attempted and failed hostage rescue. What role did Brzezinski play in each of those episodes?
So Camp David was Carter's idea. I mean, Carter was very zealous on wanting to be the president who restored peace to the biblical lands. And it was very much the Sunday school. The Baptist there as well was part of it. And this was a rare issue on which both Brzezinski and Vance agreed with each other and the president. So they were all rowing in one direction. Brzezinski and Vance would, everybody would complain about Carter's obsessive reading and attention to detail. He read as much as some subsequent presidents have read as little. I mean, he was an extraordinary consumer. And he'd go into documents and complain about the subnumbering. Documents that Brzezinski said, don't read, just sign, 100-page long. And Carter on page 57 would say, what's the bullet system here? It doesn't make sense. All of which, caused them great frustration, except at Camp David, where Carter's mastery of detail of every single document, of the sort of topography of the Sinai Desert, which was part of what had to be resolved, but also the history of the UN resolutions about the West Bank and the occupied territories. His grasp of detail over those 13 days was what clinched this very unlikely deal between Begin, Israel's quite obdurate and skeptical leader, and Anwar Sadat, Egypt's romantic, risk-taking leader. And somehow Carter managed to pull that off. On Iran, I mean, there are other things to say about Camp David, but Iran, is really where Brzezinski's greatest failure happened. And Carter, I did a written interview with him in a couple of years before he died, and he made it sort of very clear that was where he was most badly advised by Brzezinski, and Brzezinski advised, he bullied Carter, along with outside help from the Rockefellers and from Henry Kissinger, that you have to admit the Shah of Iran to the United States for medical treatment. The Shah was already exiled. The revolution had begun. He had fled. He had lymphoma. And the argument was, well, only in the United States will there be the medical facilities to treat him. A, that was wrong. He could have been treated and was being treated elsewhere. B, Brzezinski didn't insist as a condition of his admittance, of his asylum to America, that he renounce claims to the Peacock throne, which any knowledge of recent Iranian history would have told him he should do, because that very same Shah, as a younger man, had been put back on the throne in the 1953 Anglo-American coup. So admitting the Shah then really roiled up the streets in Tehran and the mullahs and radicalized and led, a couple of weeks later to the storming of the American embassy. I'd sort of assign a bit less blame to Brzezinski for Operation Eagle Claw, Desert One, which came to naught in Desert One. It was a really madcap rescue 48-hour rescue operation with multiple stages, sort of extracting 52 hostages from the middle of a 10 million, 12 million teeming metropolis, and then spending the day in the desert, and then another night, and then getting picked up by C-130s. I mean, any one bit of it had gone wrong, the whole thing collapsed, and that's what happened at the first stage. But the Pentagon was so confident that this was foolproof and that it would work. You have to assign most of the blame to them, but Brzezinski was very gung-ho, and he became very critical of, he became very worried that Carter was making himself, his own political future, hostage to the fate of the hostages by conducting a Rose Garden campaign and not having Christmas lights at the White House, essentially going into mourning. He gave that sort of Walter Cronkite, that nightly hostage count that they had on TV, Ted Koppel as well. He sort of gave them that Damocles sword, which hung over as the only measure of is Carter successful or not. And Brzezinski would have stormed in there and sacrificed some hostage lives. I mean, he wouldn't have, but Carter was deeply ethical on not wanting to lose life. And there were no combat deaths during the Carter administration. I don't think that's been true for any other administration in a century or so.
There's a question that's come in from Ellen. How did Brzezinski's Cold War lens, especially his tendency to view global events through the prism of US-Soviet competition, affect his analysis of regional conflicts? especially in the Middle East. And maybe if you get a chance, you could expand that to the Afghanistan, the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, and his response to that.
That's a really good question, Ellen. I mean, what I'd say is I didn't use this in the book, but the famous Isaiah Berlin essay where he talks about the fox and the hedgehog. And the fox is tactical and wily and knows lots of things, but the hedgehog knows one big thing. And I didn't, because it's a bit of a cliche, I didn't use this about Kissinger and Brzezinski in the book, but Brzezinski would be the hedgehog because he did get the Soviet Union right as relates to the Eastern Bloc, its weaknesses, its Achilles heel, also its growing sort of gerontocracy, the fact that it was ossified, falling behind technologically. He sort of got that early. But it meant that he sometimes saw Soviet sort of reds under the bed where they did not exist. And one example is Iran. He just couldn't interpret what was happening in Iran unless this was a Soviet sort of plot. And it wasn't. It was really completely unrelated. Again, he was in reasonably good company. You know, there wasn't, you couldn't Google what is a Shia, you know, in 1978. But they were all ignorant about, and nobody expected a revolution to come from the medieval era. And revolutions came with Soviet tanks, or at least Soviet advisors. But, you know, he did get Iran very wrong, and he did see it through the Cold War lens, more controversially, but also more effectively. He did before the Soviets invaded Afghanistan. At Christmas 1979, Christmas Day 1979, he had been stirring up Soviet paranoia about the rebellious mullahs in the countryside because there was a pro-Soviet government there in Kabul, but a rebellion against it. It was closing mosques, you know, it was conducting land reform, and it had provoked a rural insurgency, which Brzezinski stoked, not with weapons until later on, but with propaganda and other forms of equipment. The Soviets were very paranoid that Afghanistan exposed their soft underbelly in the south. All these Muslim republics, Kazakhstan, Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, etc., could be radicalized too. And so Brzezinski was very Machiavellian about that. And then when the Soviets invaded, you know, said, this is God against atheist Soviet Union. And so it was very effective in giving the Soviets their own Vietnam, their own quagmire, and it did help bleed the Soviets. It contributed to its collapse at the end of the 1980s. But of course, it became very controversial after 9/11, where Brzezinski's evangelism for these jihadist groups took on a very different light. I know he was rather unfairly, I think, called the godfather of Al-Qaeda, branded that by some people after 9/11. Al-Qaeda was formed in 1987, which is 6 years after Carter left office. So I think that was a bit of a stretch, but it was something that he had to sort of explain away. And what he said was, it's still worth the price. We help bring down a superpower, and if terrorism, you know, is something we have to deal with, it's not nearly the equivalent scale threat.
Did Brzezinski have a specific objective in supporting the Mujahideen, both before and then after the Soviet invasion, although it was non-military? I mean, was the idea to draw the Soviets in, or once they were in, was it, you know, give them their own Vietnam and produce casualties, or was it a variant on the nationalities kind of issue where you're going to have at least people who won't stand for the kind of Russian-inflected Marxist government in a place like Afghanistan?
So, you know, there have been people who've argued, one or two scholars, that Brzezinski created the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. I don't buy that, and I sort of was pretty exhaustive in my research, and I don't see that. He detected a Soviet paranoia. Brezhnev, the general secretary, was by this stage very sort of ailing, drinking a lot, on medication, slurring his words, getting more and more paranoid. And the Afghans had this leader, a guy called Amin, who had been a student at Columbia University in the 60s, when Brzezinski was teaching there. And he'd even belonged to something called the Afghan Students Group, which Brzezinski helped publicize, was CIA funded. Now, there's no evidence that Brzezinski, that Amin worked for the CIA or was pro-American. He was a pro-Soviet dictator, just one that Brezhnev didn't trust. But the way that Brzezinski stoked paranoia about Amin, and he got the American charge, the ambassador had actually been assassinated, the US ambassador, but he got the charge to meet with Amin a lot. So he really stoked this paranoia. And allegedly, when the Soviets invaded, Brzezinski turned to his military aide, Bill Odom, and said, they've taken the bait. Cannot corroborate that statement. And Odom it doesn't appear in Brzezinski's diaries, and Odom only said it years later. But it kind of fits with, I mean, I think they would have invaded anyway, but Brzezinski was very happy that they did.
There's a question here from David. How would Zbig have viewed the current era of great power competition? And maybe even to sharpen that a little more, what would he do about Russia and Ukraine right now?
It's a really interesting question. I mean, his era was, of course, mostly, I mean, the Cold War was a bipolar era. And we're in a multipolar era. And that's more complicated and potentially more dangerous and less predictable. So I think the first thing he would agree with Kissinger on this, and George Kennan and Dean Acheson and all the other sort of great strategic figures of the last century would agree, you really need to know stuff to conduct good foreign policy. You need to kind of speak their languages, travel there, test your theories against what it looks like on the ground. You know, this goes back to Sun Tzu. You know, you need to sort of step in your enemy's shoes, think how they think, to anticipate what they're going to do, and have greater ability to shape events. So I think he would start with that. And, you know, there isn't an over sort of flowing cup of evidence right now that that's the mindset with this administration towards foreign policy. But even towards a more conventional one, like the Biden administration, it wasn't really full of sinologists. So people often ask, you know, where are the great strategists today? And I think there's a couple of reasons why they're not in Washington, or at least not at senior jobs, administration jobs in Washington. It's not lack of supply. There are plenty of really smart people like you, Richard. I mean, tons of people with a lot of knowledge. There's a demand problem, I think, with American politics. It just doesn't value foreign policy entrepreneurialism as much as it used to. I think that a lot of think tanks are more sort of systematically cautious. But I don't have a metric of this. And I think this is a question you could answer better than me, Richard. But I'll mention one point, which is in 1993, when the Cold War long since ended, there was this spirit of great sort of celebration in Washington that America had won the ideological victory peacefully. Soviet Union had collapsed. And so there was a spirit of triumphalism. And Brzezinski wrote this book, Out of Control, warning against hubris. And the losers, or those who perceive themselves to be the losers of the Cold War and of this unipolar world that we were moving into, would get together, would gang up, and you know, cause us problems over the horizon. And that's really, and he called this the alliance of the aggrieved. And he said it would be China, Russia, Iran, North Korea, and others. And that's exactly what we're seeing. And so again, I think this is something Kissinger and Brzezinski would agree on, which is you don't want to unite your enemies, you want to divide them. So let's try and stoke that Russian neuralgia about China. You know, I imagine there would be that sort of strategic and tactical advice going around. You know, Russia is, the Chinese still have the maps of what the territory of Chinese territory that the Tsars annexed from China in the 19th century. They still have those maps. China is a densely populated nation. The Siberian tundra is like empty, and it's going to be possibly the largest beneficiary of climate change. It's becoming arable land. Not that hard to stoke Russian neuroticism about China. No sort of aim there, I think, of becoming allies with Russia, but just create a bit more distance between them would serve America's room for maneuver. That I imagine would be the kind of an example of the kind of thinking both would probably agree on.
It is his prescience about the potential formation and the danger therein of a China, Russia, Iran axis that was glued together by anti-hegemonic, being anti-American grievance that would have China as the most powerful partner and Russia sort of a follower with this. I mean, that was 30 years ago when none of this was supposed to happen. We weren't even supposed to have an Islamic Republic anymore, and Russia was integrating into the West and China, and all of this. So it's pretty amazing. But that actually ties back with, I wanted to pick up on one of the things you said before, just in terms of the models of policymakers. So for the first couple of decades after World War II, you had, almost like the foreign policy equivalent of the gentleman farmer, where you had a banker or a lawyer, and they sort of did foreign policy as a hobby. And they'd go into government for a couple of years and they'd sort of do it. And then they go back to Wall Street, they go back to their law firm or things like that. And with Kissinger and Brzezinski, and then a few others after, you have people that dedicated their entire lives, their whole career to international relations, to foreign policy, to scholarship, in and out of government. And then, of course, it's been a very mixed bag since. I mean, do you see a pattern? I mean, is one model more successful than the other, or are there distinctions to be drawn from the professional backgrounds of people doing this, a la Kissinger and Brzezinski?
So your question reminds me of this letter that Brzezinski got from this guy called Burton, who was actually a Vanderbilt. He was a great grandson of Cornelius Vanderbilt. So he had a Rockefeller and a Vanderbilt as sponsors. The letter that he sent to Brzezinski was when Brzezinski got this job at the Policy and Planning at the State Department in LBJ's administration. So this is 1966. And he sends him the letter saying, "Congratulations on your appointment. It is good and necessary for one's experience to do a spell of time in government, but you should not stay there too long." And I remember reading this thinking, do you know who you're writing to? I mean, this is... So there was this, I mean, one of the sort of great diplomats of American history is, of course, Dean Acheson, who is the epitome of that Anglo sort of American elite who sort of made their name elsewhere, were born comfortable, wonderfully connected, and who felt an obligation to public service, but didn't make it a sort of vocation, a lifelong quest. You can't really criticize the record of Dean Acheson. He was present at the creation. Others like Averell Harriman, these were the sort of last of the sort of grandee wasps. You couldn't possibly sort of follow that model if you were an immigrant. And you didn't have a family board member at that white shoe law firm or whatever it was their backgrounds were. You had to find a sponsor. And so a lot of their fellow academics, there was one at Harvard, Stanley Hoffman, really disapproved. Adam Ulam was another, really disapproved of both Brzezinski and Kissinger as people who are just using academia as a stepping stone to power. So this sort of scholar-politician thing was really their invention, I think. And you're right, it's not that in evidence today. As I say, it's not a question, it's not a problem of supply. America still has the greatest universities in the world. I just think somehow that sort of pipeline is broken to Washington.
So Brzezinski does 4 years during the Carter administration, comes out still relatively young, of course, outside of government, remains very influential and very well known for decades more. Did he aspire to go back? And how was he at playing the political game? Because he voted for and told people he voted for and endorsed people on both sides of the aisle, which tends not to be terribly boostering of one's partisan credentials if you're trying to do that. And I mean, my old boss, John McCain in 2000, he supported John McCain in 2008. When McCain got the nomination, he supported Barack Obama. So, what was his positioning, or was there gamesmanship, or was this, that rare thing in Washington where he actually had a conscience and did what he thought was politically right? And how did that fit into his subsequent government aspirations?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I mean, he backed candidates based on their foreign policy position. I mean, he wasn't a brilliant sort of an analyst of America or American society. He knew much more about Russia, to be frank. But he was a social liberal. He was progressive. He believed in the democratic sort of worldview in terms of domestic policy. But on foreign policy, when you had somebody like Nixon versus McGovern, who essentially, for all intents and purposes, wanted to withdraw from the world in penance for Vietnam, or at least that's how Brzezinski saw it, he would do something quite self-harming to his career as the Democrat Kissinger by making it known he had voted for Nixon. And then, of course, in 1988, he actually was he was co-chair of George H.W. Bush's campaign, co-chair with Kissinger, the only time they've been on the same presidential campaign, against Dukakis, because he saw Dukakis as sort of updated version of McGovern. And I mean, he made a lot of enemies, including, his protege briefly, Madeleine Albright, who was the foreign issues director for Dukakis. But I think the reason he chose Bush, with some self-harm, as I say, it made him, for large chunks of his career, he was hated by the left. And the nickname for him was Darth Vader in the 70s, that being the era of, The Empire Strikes Back, etc. And so I guess he didn't feel he was sacrificing any love on the sort of progressive wing of the left if he endorsed Bush. But he did, I think, expect Bush, who he'd known for quite a while, to offer him a job. That was the last realistically thought he could get a job, maybe as Secretary of State, and all that Bush offered him was ambassador to Japan. And he just thought that wasn't big enough. It didn't suit his ambitions. So that was the last time he really, but yes, his endorsement of Obama was, his endorsement of Obama in the primaries against Hillary Clinton. That was a big moment.
It was
for the Obama campaign. And they described it to me. I mean, I was actually covering that as a journalist, but they described it to me as a punch the air moment. That's what Ben Rhodes called it, because Hillary Clinton had been doing these 3 a.m. ads saying, who do you trust at 3 a.m., me or this, unknown from Springfield, Illinois? And so having Darth Vader endorse Obama, that was a really big moment. It sort of blunted the Clinton attack.
And it's hard to remember, but back then, that was before the collapse of Lehman Brothers and the global financial crisis. So it was a foreign policy election. And so that was the currency of that one ran on, was your credentials to answer the 3 a.m. phone call or manage the wars or stop terrorists and all these other kinds of things. And to have a relative neophyte like Obama endorsed by, a grand, sort of man like Brzezinski made a big splash. There is a last question from the audience, from Joanna. What did Brzezinski feel was his greatest or favorite success?
So I know what Carter thought was his favorite success, as in Carter's favorite success, which he attributed to Brzezinski, and that was China normalization, which, although the opening had happened in 1972 under Nixon Kissinger, it had got into abeyance, into the doldrums, and Chairman Mao's death, and the Chinese had got more and more sort of alienated from America, and Brzezinski kept pushing for China normalization as a chessboard move to weaken the Soviets. And it was a very consequential move. Carter listed that as his highest achievement as foreign policy achievement as president. Again, looks more controversial with hindsight. Brzezinski, though, for sure, it would be reading the Soviets right. That's what he would, this is the hedgehog thing. That is what he would look to. I think, with pretty good grounds, that his predictive record and therefore the policies that flowed from that, this idea that you could take the ideological battle to the Soviets, again, having for so many administrations been bogged down in Vietnam. Carter wasn't bogged down, but he was the first president in a long time. And so you should take the ideological offensive to the Soviets again by weaponizing human rights, the Helsinki Treaty, stirring up Helsinki watch groups behind the Iron Curtain, civic groups, trade unions like Solidarity. That, you know, contributed very heavily to the manner in which the Cold War ended. And I think, you know, the date we should remember, and it's a sort of an ambivalent date, is June the 4th, 1989. And that's the date not only of the ghastly Tiananmen Square massacre, which is what it's chiefly remembered for, but also the date that Solidarity swept the Polish elections. They weren't rigged, but they were tightly circumscribed elections. And nevertheless, they still won 99 out of 100 seats. And Jaruzelski, the Polish leader, with whom Brzezinski by then had a very good and sort of almost advisory relationship, as well as being an advisor to Solidarity, Jaruzelski said, okay, we will permit you to form a government. That's the day the Soviet Union ended, when it gave up a monopoly on political power. And Gorbachev, of course, accepted Poland's decision. Not November the 9th, 5 months later, when the Berlin Wall fell. That came much later. It fell really in June. And that was a co-creation of Brzezinski. And it takes us back to his undergraduate thesis. Mm-hmm. I think he would for sure, and I think probably actually did, if I remember rightly, he wasn't very good on, he wasn't very introspective. But I think that was his proudest achievement.
Well, I've heard it said that you honor an author not by reading their books, but by buying them. So I encourage anyone who does not yet have Zbig, The Life of Zbigniew Brzezinski, America's Great Power Prophet, to buy, borrow, check out, whatever, get it. It's a spectacularly good volume. And Ed, congratulations on the book. Thanks for joining us. And for everybody watching, we'll see you next time.
Real pleasure. Thank you so much, Richard. I really enjoyed that.
Great. Thank you. Bye, everyone.